Hello there, it's Thomas Maher from PlanetF1.com reporting here from the Belgian Grand Prix at Spa-Francorchamps, which was won by McLaren's Oscar Piastri ahead of Lando Norris. Third went to Ferrari Charles Leclerc, and fourth went to, I think we can call him an outside championship challenger at this stage, Max Verstappen's Red Bull coming home in fourth place. Where do we start with today's race? Because it was a pretty insipid affair, I think. It was one of those races where the potential for it to be great was there, perhaps if we'd started racing an hour earlier. Most of the race took place in dry conditions, a couple of laps in kind of damp, tricky conditions at the start of the race, on a day where rain was forecast, so most of the drivers had already set up compromises in order to race in those rainy conditions. But instead what happened was the rain started to fall while we were on the grid at 10 to 3 or so, local time, and the rain was not as bad as what we'd seen earlier in the day, maybe during Formula 2. It definitely wasn't as bad as what we saw at Silverstone 3 weeks ago. But the decision was made that on the formation lap, they decided against continuing with the race. And as a result, it was red flagged, everyone came back to the pits, and we sat there and waited for over an hour for the race to get going. And when it did, the conditions had improved so much that within a few laps we were looking at slick tyres anyway. And this had an effect on the outcome of the race because so many of the drivers had set up compromises. So yes, it was a conservative call, I think, by race control, but let's put it in some context. This is a track, Spa-Francorchamps is a track that has seen quite some tragedies in recent years. And even on Thursday, Pierre, who was a driver who knows all too well about that kind of tragedy. He was best friends with the late Antoine Hubert, who was killed here in a Formula 2 crash in 2019. Now, that had nothing to do with the driving conditions, of course, but that's not what can be said for Delano van Toff, the young Dutch driver who was killed here in 2023, halfway down the Kemmel Straight. And he was remembered as well on the memorial run organised by Gasly on Thursday evening. Van Toff's crash did take place in wet conditions with low visibility, and the drivers were complaining about no visibility while on the formation lap. So this is a place where the rain kind of lingers in the air a little bit. Visibility isn't always fantastic. So even though it might have looked okay on TV, and quite a lot of the track did look okay, I think the decision to kind of err on the side of safety was probably the right one. Yes, you can argue that these are the best drivers in the world and we should be taking more risks. But, you know, I think Silverstone 3 weeks ago showed that when the feeling is right, yes, we can go for it. But Spa-Francorchamps is a track that has shown that in tricky conditions, the high-speed nature of it, the lack of visibility, things can go wrong. So I think we did about a 44-lap race today. We got the 100% race in. Everything was obviously fine and safe. But of course, it does beg the question of why then are we compromising on setups on Saturday if we're not going to race using those compromises on Sunday. So let's go through what actually happened on track today. Oscar Piastri won by getting ahead of Lando Norris on the first lap. Again, we saw that lead change on the first lap coming about because of that slipstream down the long Kemmel Straight. So the two McLaren boys, Norris ahead of Piastri at the start. Norris was slightly offline through turn one. This allowed Piastri to latch onto the back of him all the way down the hill into Eau Rouge, which is just over there where I'm recording now. But going over the hill at Raidillon, Piastri said that he decided he was going to lift less than Norris. He was going to watch the distance to Lando and just lift less. He said, obviously, it got squirrely going over the hill. It was a little bit tricky, but he managed to keep the foot planted more than Lando. And this gave him the momentum all the way down the Kemmel Straight. And he was able to slipstream his way past and stay ahead of Norris. So his advantage, Lando was able to keep up with Piastri through those tricky conditions as the pair pulled away from everybody else. But Piastri's job was made easier through the first round of stops because McLaren didn't double stack their drivers when they were swapping to the dries. Piastri went for the medium compound, Norris went for the hard compound. This was expected, this was discussed, that the guy in second would probably go for the alternative strategy just to see what was happening. So there was no surprises for either driver. The only question in terms of reviewing the race for Norris is in whether it would have been better for him to double stack behind Piastri and make that stop on the same lap, because that extra lap he did on the intermediate tyres on a drying track, an increasingly drying track, did cost him quite a few seconds. He lost, he was basically within 1 or 2 seconds of Piastri prior to the stop, and this gap had increased to 8 or 9 seconds afterwards. So throughout the rest of the race, over the next 35 laps or so, Piastri, he just maintained his lead, held on to his medium compound tyres. Obviously, Norris on the hard tyres slowly did come back at him, especially in the last kind of 6 or 7 laps, but the gap was such that Piastri was able to bring it home. And of course, this was helped as well by the fact that Lando Norris did make a couple of mistakes as well. We saw one at Puhan and another one then through La Source in the closing laps. So McLaren had it all to themselves, basically. Charles Leclerc, he had gambled on a dry tyre setup, and this obviously paid off for him very well because most of the race was held in dry conditions. Verstappen was all over him to the first stint. In the second stint, then the remainder of the race, Verstappen able to keep up with Leclerc, but wasn't able to do much about him. He had been set up for a much wetter race. As a result, he was compromised down the straights, and Verstappen was a bit frustrated by this because obviously he was on the wrong setup as well at Silverstone, and he found it was the other extreme then today. But he also said that he felt things were too cautious. He was one of the only drivers to say that maybe the calls were too conservative today. Things were too cautious. He did say, if you can't see, you can always lift. And I thought that just sums up Verstappen's character quite well, because it's so pragmatic and practical in how he is thinking there. So Verstappen came home in 4th place, just 1.6 seconds behind Leclerc. And so 5th place went to Mercedes' George Russell. Russell was underwhelmed with the performance. He said it was the worst performance of the season for Mercedes. The car isn't feeling nice, and he suspects that it's linked to the front wing that was introduced in Spain. This is obviously referring back to the introduction of a TD earlier this season. Andrew Shovlin spoke to us afterwards. He said that they don't think it's linked to the TD. Obviously, we can't be sure, but they don't think it's linked to the TD because obviously Mercedes took that 1-3 in Canada with the same front wing. So whatever it is, they haven't quite figured it out just yet, Mercedes. Also spare a thought for Kimi Antonelli. He was very upset this weekend. He's quite open about the fact his confidence has been dashed throughout the European season so far. He's struggling to come to terms with the handling of the car, with the balance isn't suiting him, and as a result, things are just getting to him a little bit, and I think he needs a little bit of an arm around the shoulder. Things not going quite as smoothly as I think he maybe thought they would at this point in the season. And you have to feel for Kimi. He's an 18-year-old, still very young, very inexperienced, and he's very much thrown in at the deep end at Mercedes this year. I think he's performed remarkably, but I think he just does need that little bit of nurturing, that little bit of an arm around the shoulder just to help him come back to where he was. So at Red Bull, then Yuki Tsunoda, he lost out. He had a good qualifying with the upgraded floor yesterday, but Laurent Mekies explained afterwards, Laurent, in his first weekend, of course, with Red Bull, he said that Red Bull called Yuki in a lap too late. It cost Yuki 3 places, and as a result, that cost him any chance at points. He finished down in 11th place. So, yeah, we've got Hungary next week, Budapest, very, very different track. It's expected to be hot, sunny, warm, and of course it's the scene of Oscar Piastri's first win, the first anniversary of that first win. How far he has come in the last year. He now has a 16-point lead over Lando Norris in the championship. It's 266 for Oscar, 250 for Norris, and Max Verstappen a further 65 points back. So it's an 81-point gap back to Max Verstappen in the championship. It's going to be very difficult for Max to have any chance of overcoming that, particularly with a car that doesn't quite seem the match of McLaren. So join us on planetf1.com and of course across social media over the next week to keep up to date with all the updates from Spa Francorchamps. All the best. We'll talk to you after Hungary.